Hey everybody, welcome to just a quick primer on Italy deck building in Wargame and Dragon. Of course, in case you don't know yet, the DLC will release on this Thursday, the 29th, it should be, of August, of course. I don't know what it'll cost yet, nobody knows except Eugen, so you'll probably find out on that day. And on that day, the patch log for the pretty big and significant balance patch that comes with it will also be released. And in case you don't know, ranked leaderboard will also be reset. Now, I will just quickly show you 3 ways to build Italy. That is unspec armor, sorry, mech and motorized. Now, of course, technically you can build airborne and such as well. And I will never stop anyone from doing that, right? Even though some people might think otherwise, I actually much rather have you play decks that you find fun than just try to follow somebody like me who's tryharding and just copy their deck and not have any fun with it, right? I just want to put it out there. And of course, I'm not saying these are the optimal ways to build the deck, but maybe if you just want to jump in, you're not entirely sure, and you just want something to start off of, maybe this will help you. Or just a quick pointer as to which units are important for certain specs or yada yada yada, right? Then, that might be helpful for you. Or maybe you just like listening to me, which is nobody. So, like I said, technically you can make airborne, marine, and some are more viable than others, but I think the three strongest or most capable Italian decks are Mech, Moto, and Unspec. So let's quickly build some of them. So Italy Unspec, let's start with the most basic one. Basic in the sense that you get everything you want. As I've said in multiple times, with a 15% availability bonus, 4 per card units become 5 per card. So you get 5 here of these bad boys instead of 4, which is like a good all-round CV. You get a reasonable amount of them. It's reasonably survivable, right? It has 2 front, 2 side, which means that essentially 75% of it gets reduced HE damage, i.e. artillery, right? For example, 7 HE artillery, if it hits you up front, deals, instead of 7 damage, 2.8 damage. That's very significant. And the side armor is left and right, so that's basically 50% of the areas where artillery could hit you. Assuming, it would, you're in the center of the AoE circle, right? So that's why side armor actually matters quite a bit. And 1 armor, in case you don't know, does not reduce incoming HE damage unless you're talking about infantry rifles. So, for example, you can easily get away with this and be it in a Fiat or a helicopter infantry CV, and you still have 8 CVs. Another thing I should mention, and I should have mentioned it at the start, this is mostly focused on 1 versus 1, but in general, team decks, unless you're playing like completely different scenarios, right, which is like 60-minute total destruction or something like that, in general, team decks are not that different. Team decks just usually have a bigger focus on you still have to focus on unit value, but also card value, meaning that not just you get some good value for the price, but you also get a lot out of a single card, so you don't run out of certain types of units. Biggest thing here is, for example, tanks. In 1 versus 1s, you probably only want 1 card of Arietes. In team games, you definitely want 2, for example. But I think the tank tab is the major difference. Infantry tab, Recon tab usually doesn't really change that much. But if there's a certain thing like that, I'll get back to it. So this is like a good setup. In team game, if you play team games where usually you have to capture less zones, you can of course just run like a leopard or something for something tankier for just 10 points more, right? But if you're worried about availability for 1 versus 1s, especially ranked, go for that. For now, we're gonna build a FOB version. FOB has more HP now. Infantry tab, well, the Alpini 90 are really a must-have. They're incredibly strong, they're tanky, they have the best recoilless rifle in the game. They're just a must-have. I would definitely recommend to get them in the ground transport if you can. They're still worth bringing if you can't, for example in Moto, but ground transport just makes them so much more versatile. Then you probably want Fanteria di Linea 90, simply because Apilas for 15 points, and you still get MG3 essentially online infantry. It's just too good to pass up on. You probably want something Moto. You can go for Kolmoskin, which you still get 7 up with it. They're solid. They're not amazing, but they're very solid. If you want something more all-roundy or more cheaper, you can of course go for the Paracadà Tisti in the Fiat, which are 25 points with an Apilas. They're basically like Rima, but you get the MG3 instead of the Mini-Me. Very solid as well. Those are really your only wheeled options. Of course, you get Fanteria in the wheel as well, but they're not gonna be your bread and butter for infantry fighting on wheels, because due to their base cost, that 5 additional points compared to the 5-pointer obviously racks up. I've been using the Kolmoskin, but of course you can also just go for the Paracadà Tisti. It's that name, man. That name, Paracadà Tisti. It's such a tongue twister. It's the wrong transport. And usually you still want the meat shield, because even though they're cheap, they're not quite cheap enough to be a proper meat shield. You can go for a service, but since the base Fanteria still get a great 5-pointer, you probably want those, because they can hold themselves against infantry. They're really gonna struggle against vehicles. You just gotta keep that in mind. You can probably also just get away with running 2 cars of these bad boys. Actually, I haven't tried that yet. It's gonna be a bit more expensive, but you're always gonna have Apilas around. And now that I said that, this may actually be the way to go. Something like this. But since I haven't tried it yet, I'm not gonna tell you to do that. So for now, let's just run it like this. It's not like this is horrible or anything, right? You just gotta keep in mind those are pretty bad against anything that isn't a 1-armor 5-pointer in the forest. Or a 1-armor vehicle in the forest. But you can probably just run 2 cars of these. And honestly, a card of Milan 2 is always good to have. Definitely upvet them because their base accuracy isn't that great. And you still get 7 upvetted instead of 6 to do the availability bonus. And infantry is always a lot to talk about, so the rest should be a bit quicker here. Artillery. In this case, we're running a fob. If you watch my stream, I've actually ran this like without a fob, in which case I ran 2 cards of the mortar for direct fire support, which works very well, by the way, because of its shortened aim time and lower dispersion, so it's going to be pretty accurate and on point. Carries a lot of ammo as well, so you don't have to resupply the fob, you just buy new ones. Definitely works. Since we're running a fob though, M110, M107, good option. M109 also kind of works, the basic one. I'd probably suggest running an MLRS. The M270 is definitely more impactful. The Firos 30, which is basically an RM70 really on Blue 4, does have the advantage of just having a much lower downtime between salvos. So while the individual salvo is obviously not nearly as strong, you have a much lower downtime. So it's not really a objectively worse option to run the Firos 30 over the M270. And of course, if you run one tube artillery, I would suggest either of these two. I always have a soft spot for the M107. Honestly, I would almost suggest downwetting it, just get lots of them. 60 points, 9 HE is very cheap. And unlike the basic M110, it doesn't have very low range. Or just the good old M110A2, right? Very solid options as well. Anti-air, the automatic downwetted is a must. Just make sure to radar the micro. I also feel like the CDM25 is a must. Just if you have no non-radar AA in your deck, it just can be very awkward. And this also is good for base defense. I would just heavily suggest running this. You don't have to, but I think you're missing out if you skip on this. And then usually the third slot is either the Spada or the Hawk. Spada gives you wheels and it's pretty affordable and mobile. The Hawk gives you the range. I've run a lot of the Spada, and while I don't think it's bad, I've had many issues dealing with plane spam with this deck because their air superiority fighters aren't quite up to the task. So I would personally suggest running the Hawk too. You can even run the base Hawk if you really want, honestly. I'd probably still go for the Hawk too. 5% is a lot and just 10 points. It also pairs pretty well with the automatic or the CDAM, because both basically just need 1 hit to finish off a plane. With the Spada Aspite, it also deals 7 HE, which is something very important actually. Because for one, it means that just like many of the Red Force 7 HE missiles, like the OSA or the Tor, you can't just one-shot planes. But also, having 7... let me put it this way. Many people will more or less ignore that, because, oh, you gotta hit twice anyway, which is right, if it's just a Spada shooting. But if you reduce it to like 3 HP and you have other AA in form of CDAM or the automatic, it means, of course, being Spanx, they need a lot less shots actually, or to hit, to finish them off. So that 1 extra HE compared to like a Roland, which is 6 HE, or a Rapier, which is 5 HE, very important. Still, I think nowadays I'd probably go for the Honk, but keep in mind it has pretty low speed. For a motor, which is always good to have, I'd really run this one. The other ones are fine as well, of course, if you're put off by the 55 points cost. Tanks, Ariete is kind of a must because the next best tank is the Mark III. The 040 Mark III is pretty good as well, though. And then the Mark IIA is honestly a solid, light-ish tank. Honestly, all of the 040s are kind of okay. I would probably not go for the basic one, and the 50-point one just lacks medium optics, so I wouldn't recommend them. For the same price, you can also get the ERA, which doesn't really look that bad on paper, but it's a bit slower, it's clunkier, has worse stabilizer, and no medium optics. But it does get 4 additional armor, right? And it has 1 lower AP. Personally, I'd still go for the, if you want one of those, go for the 040, but the M60 also works. And if you want like a cheap fire support spam tank, the M47 is actually pretty good. 3 HE on 8 RPM with a Browning and 4 armor, solid for the price, speed and autonomy. Against infantry and like APCs, especially at closer ranges, pretty solid, honestly. This is just a good all-round Griffin helicopter. If you really just wanna spot, obviously you can go for the 40-point one, but don't underestimate like the double 50 kills and the FFARs. Subin are, I think, kind of a must-have because the wheeled infantry is usually not as big of a focus for most people. And these actually, while they're not great at fighting, right? Unlike the Alpini, they get access to wheels, but they still have the Folgore. So if you go to forward towns or something, unload them, they can really slow down your opponent, even if it's just one squad. So I think one squad here is a must-have, plus they can just be annoying sneaking around. And then you can either run 2 cards of them, which is perfectly fine. I like to run a card of Bersaglieri. They're just decent shock infantry. While they struggle against vehicles, they're good against infantry. And I don't really see a point of the line infantry. If they had something like they don't even need an Apilas, but a better AT weapon, there would be a reason to maybe run them, similar to Hussars 85, assuming Commandos Para didn't exist. But yeah, in this deck, no. Para Cecchini, if you want snipers, there you have it. If you're not communicating with your team or building a certain deck based on what your team has or brings, I don't really see a reason to run them. But if you're, of course, having certain strats or for certain maps, and you definitely need a sniper team, of course, it's a sniper team, right? The armament doesn't really matter because they're meant to spot, not necessarily kill. I mean, of course, sometimes there are situations where it's nice to have the RPG or something, but I think for most situations it's not as important. The big downside is, unlike any other sniper team, they're only 25 kmh because they're shock. And unlike the Canadian Rees, they're not classified as light infantry, apparently. Or it's an oversight. I don't know. For Recon, it's a toss-up between the two. You can, of course, run both, but I think it's a bit overkill because they basically just do more or less the same thing. And they're also at a very similar price point. I think the Fiat 60mm is just too good to pass up on. It can just mulch down enemy IFVs and such from forest positions. And with its RPM, once they're in range, of course it has lower range than the Centauro, but once they're in range, they're gonna have a much harder time to get, out alive because of your high rate of fire. If you get shotted by a Centauro with its 8 RPM, you might have enough time to just get out of range or break line of sight again. Both are very good. And one of them is a must-have. You can run both. I probably wouldn't, but you can. Then you can run the 90mm if you want something spammy, or the Leopard 1 if you want something sort of survivable. Both good options. Vehicle type actually doesn't have a lot of vehicles, but a lot of good stuff. C13, Centauro, the Ito Jeep, the Fiat with the rockets, the Epheros with the rockets, which is pretty much the same, just a different chassis. All of these are great options. Even this thing's kind of okay if you really want a TOW 2 launcher on ground. Centauro is a must though, especially if you don't run the Recon variant. Even though you run this as well. But the thing is, it's just cheaper to bring in Centauro here than to bring the other Centauro here, because this is 3 AP. C1360 is kind of like your pseudo IFV, because you don't get any IFV in this deck. This is basically the closest thing, price-wise, and the way it plays. Just unlike IFVs with autocannons, it obviously can't shoot at helicopters, and you don't want to really be at these, like, pretty much ever, unless you're specifically fighting against a vehicle and you need the AP scaling, at these like 3, 4, 500 meter ranges like IFVs, because you don't get nearly as much out of range scaling, because you already have a basic accuracy of 60%. It's kind of a class cannon in a sense compared to other IFVs for the price. Right? If an IFV costs 30 points, it either brings a strong anti-GM or it has good armor, like a Martyr. And while these aren't a must-have, I think they're too fun to not bring. They're pretty cheap on supply, by the way, so you don't necessarily need to run a fob for these guys. And don't necessarily think of them just anti-infantry killers. They're actually not that great at killing infantry in forests, in buildings, but they're really, really good at stunning and panicking, especially vehicles. So don't underestimate them for that when it comes to that. CBD is a must-have, incredibly versatile anti-air helicopter. Mangusta or A19AT. This one is, don't underestimate it, but since this deck doesn't really have the strongest tanks, you probably want the Mangusta. Air type, lots of choices here as well. Harrier is a decent anti-tank option. Ghibli is a decent anti-tank option. Tornado A200 is a decent anti-tank option. You probably want to run 2 of those out of these 3, I would say. Again, if you're playing team games and you have a certain role and you know you won't need as many, it's always a different story. But we're just assuming like you build a deck for yourself without ever, either for 1 versus 1 or because you're just playing with randoms, or you don't want to have to adjust your deck all the time when you're playing with friends or something. They're all solid. The Ghibli is like your kind of all-rounder, because obviously you can also deal with infantry to an extent. Harrier is your also pretty good against medium tanks, because you can get 2 in 1 run since those are semi-active. Tornado A200 is a cluster, which brings its own benefits of not requiring line of sight. Yeah. Harrier is also slower. Ghibli is the best multi-roll out of these, I'd say, because it also has a gun. The Harrier, when planes don't have guns, they don't dive helicopters, right? So you're gonna have trouble to actually get these things properly off against helicopters. And Tornado with 1000 kmh and 400 turn radius, this also has 400, but a worse gun, not so great either. Seed is good to have. These days I always bring a Seed, especially now with Italy out. Against automatics, you probably want to have Seed in your deck. ASF wise, you can run 2. Maybe you should run 2, because I guess if you run the Hawk 2, maybe you don't need 2 cards. If you run the Spada or you dare to run just automatic and Seedom or something, you probably want 2 cards of ASFs. Planes can be a menace with this deck. As amazing as the automatic is, it got nerfed, not insignificantly, when it comes to its HE damage output. It's still very good though. It's still very good, but especially against like high altitude planes or seaplanes, of course, when there's seaplanes around, it can, I wouldn't say struggle, but it just, it will get like a few shots off, or not enough shots off on its own to finish off a plane. So you will often damage them, but not necessarily kill them. The Hawk 2 just gives you more versatility. So you might want to run 2 cards of ASFs. You can also run the ASI 1. ASI 1 and 2 are both good. I think if you run 2 cards, you want one of them to beat the Tornado. If you run 1 card, ASI 2 can also do the job. But I think you should never only run the ASI 1. The ASI 1 you should only choose, in my eyes, if you run it as a secondary ASF. Just because you get 3 of them. It isn't particularly great on its own, but it can be like a good second line ASF. And then when you get 3 of them, you're just never gonna run out. F104G is a good HE bomber, but just be aware of its low ECM. It's kind of like a J7 for the Chinese. And having aim 9s, while they're not great, if you have 3 of them or you can amass those F104Gs, it's still something, right? And don't forget, all the F104s now 1000 kmh. So in this case, since we have the the Hawk. Let's go for a more traditional ASF in the form of the Tornado, because ASF2 is just it's a bit specific. It's a bit like here and there. It's not very consistent. Let's go for the Tornado. For anti-tank, let's go for something simple in the form of the Ghibli. And then the Harrier. Last but not least, let's just go for an F4 and a 4G that we can't afford because we don't have activation points. Let's remove the Recon Leopard. I don't think it's as important for this deck. With the Stealth, this Fiat can also do the job. Let's just downweight it instead. And put the Harrier that we already have in F1 4G and downweight it, of course. And I'd like to have the seat at the last position. So this would be the unspec deck. Alright. Since I basically went over all of the units already, the rest should be faster. Let's take a look at the Moto deck. Moto is unchanged, and this is blue for Moto. Of course, you get not the same units. In this case, I can see a reason to go for the AR-76 because the wheeled APC does give you more HP, but not the one armor is not very relevant. So I can see why you would run for the AR-76. It's also so speedy, right? But for now, let's just stick with what we got. Infantry-wise, LP90 are a must-take, although they come in a Jinokir, which means since they're less versatile, they're clunkier to bring out. They're more expensive as well. I would probably just upweight them because they're more like units that you sprinkle around or maybe sneak around with. They're not going to be as much of a frontline unit anymore. This role is not going to be the Paragato du TST. Since you have 7 slots, you can probably afford to upweight them, bring them an elite. Maybe you still want a card of Kolmoskin. Out of Infanteria di Linea 90 is honestly still a must-have because they're cheap Apilas. And just also rank fillers, right, or town fillers. Milan 2 is a must-have because you have worse tanks. And then since you're a Moto deck, maybe you want to bring in something like a CSR Folgore, a request rifle. Because it's a lot about obviously gaining ground early on. And in general, just relying on your infantry veterancy and speed. And so having the additional versatility of Rico's rifle squads with HE, of course. And since you don't bring the LPD9 in the ground transport, they're your Folgore squad. And since you don't really have any great other weapon teams that really must have, you only have Milans as ADGMs. The Space Stinger isn't as great. And the M18 is honestly kind of a meme. This is probably the best thing we can get. And don't forget the shocks, so they're reasonably fast as well. Kolmoskin are the must-have, but I think just having elites is always good to have. And when you're fighting against a deck that has really strong infantry as well, when it comes to infantry versus infantry, then the Paragadato TST might not necessarily bring it. What you can also do, and might even be a better option, run one cut of these bad boys, the basic ones, upweighted. But just keep in mind they have the BM59, so their DPS isn't actually quite as great, because they're gonna just cap out on the accuracy ASAP, so I'm not sure how well they actually will fare. But there are an option, like 25 points for the MG3 Shock Squad, really, really good for town fighting. Then again, the BM59 is actually horrible for town fighting, right? It's kind of interesting if you think about it. Base LP, I don't really see useful in this deck at all. Also, only coming in a helicopter, a clunky helicopter at that. So just bring a card of the LPD90s. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you do not get the automatic in here. You also don't get the M270, which isn't new. MLRS, I think, is always good to have, even if it's just an okay one. I think this is just how you probably build the AA setup. I don't think you can really skip either of them. So with the Audi automatic, you definitely need better anti-plane, anti-air in the form of the Hawk. The Spada you need for some sort of wheel AA, even if it isn't the greatest, it's kind of okay. And see them as always, right? Tank-wise, you still got the 040 Mark III, which is okay. And then you shouldn't really need much more. M47 could still be a decent option. If there's some niche scenarios where you might want them, On average, you probably should never have to rely on those because of your speed. They don't really do the thing. You might want to sprinkle in some here and there for like protecting a flank or a CV against something sneaking, but other than that, if you don't have the activation points, this is the first thing to go, I think. Recon helicopters are always a must-have. Can honestly just up with this as well. And Komsubin, they're gonna be really important for you as well. While you do have the Folgore, Komsubin of course are also Recon Squad, and come in transport that can spot as well. Or you can also just forego these Folgore if you just run 2 cores of these. But it's just good to have either way. And since you have 7 slots, you can afford that. You can also still just run 1 and run a Besaliere, because we're probably gonna need some slots for this bad boy and this bad boy. And then maybe you want this, or maybe you want something like this. I'd probably go for the Fiat. It's all about speed, and honestly, in a defensive position, it's still gonna be okay with its stealth. And don't underestimate being able to spam these bad boys. It still has 2 armor, so it can even kind of tank if you will. It's also kinetic, so at certain ranges it will also one-shot 1 armor. But you can forego it. I wouldn't really go for the Fiat 20mm. It's basically a Lux A1, but a Lux A1 is... When was the last time you've really seen it? It's not bad, it's just that basically all the decks have better options, so it's kind of just overshadowed. Leopard 1A2 is of course still fine. I just think you should probably run these 3. I don't think you need to down with them, but if you really like specifically the Recon variant of the Centauro match, you can of course do that. You could have, don't forget, cheaper here and extra vets, so 1 card of Centauro should be enough. Especially with these guys and the 60mm Fiat. Other than that, it's probably the same as before, it's just you can fit in more, right? And don't underestimate these bad boys, right? The speed adds a lot to the survivability. Helicopters probably the same as before as well. And planes, you really want to lean in onto anti-tank more than before, I think. Since you have the Hawk and the Aspite, funnily enough, specifically your anti-plane AA, your anti-helicopter AA will suffer a lot with the loss of the automatic. Your anti-plane AA could be better, because you're not gonna spend... it might sound weird, and maybe it's just me, but you're not gonna spend as many points on what is mostly, or a lot also, of anti-ground support and anti-helicopter AA in the form of the automatic. But a lot more AA, your AA on average, or per point, is probably a lot stronger against planes than it was before. Because it's mostly Hawks and Aspites, which have more range than the automatic. So your anti-plane AA might actually be better, and you can probably just get away with running something like this. This might be a bit overkill. Alternatively, of course, you could just run this as well, which is basically the same as before, right? But I definitely think you can get away with this. I think you still have to run Seed, because funnily enough, I think this deck could really struggle against automatics. And especially with the increased armor of the automatic, you can't... It's much harder to one-shot now. Yeah, you can just run with the same anti-tank setup, but I think HE bombers shouldn't be as necessary, so honestly you can definitely get away with something like this. It may be a bit spicy, maybe it's not for you, but it is an option. Then you have 2 activation points left. So, funnily enough, I think I'd go for something like this. Just to have like a fast and cheap, just like anti-IV, anti-enemies Centauro type of deal, Leopard 1, lower NT-72. Just having access to like a cheaper anti-tank helicopter or Ito helicopter is nice. And since you have a FOB, you shouldn't be too worried about it just wasting its missiles, because I think when you have a FOB, I think it's better to just let it run its missiles and just let him use it, because if you try to micro them too hard, then sometimes you just miss opportunities or miss a moment where you would have just enough line of sight and you turned them on a bit too late and missed last second, etc., etc. Don't underestimate these little helicopters. I think people sleep on them so hard. Same with the Gazelle Hot 2. People just look at it and be like, oh, it's so cheap. Oh, it only has 4 missiles. Oh, they have only 20 AP. But I think they are underestimate the utility. People often think of anti-tank helicopters as, oh, it has to be able to kill a super heavy, and if it can't, it's useless. It's an it's a gross oversimplification, of course, but it's just sometimes how it feels. Last but definitely not least, Italy. Mech. Mech now doesn't get any XP for infantry anymore. Instead, you get 2 XP for vehicles. You still get the lowered cost and the increased slots in the infantry tab, though. I'd probably go for something like this. Let's run a farm again, because I think most people want farms, so let's do it like that. This deck actually kind of struggles in forest fights, which Mech usually doesn't, but it doesn't have close range fire support. It doesn't have really, except for maybe the M47, it doesn't really have fire support that likes fighting in forests. Many other mech decks have either something like autocannons, which obviously just scale very well with range, most of them at least, or they have good forest fighting tanks, or they have something like CEVs, BMPTs, right, what have you. This deck really doesn't. So you have to keep that in mind. So it's actually not as great. It's a good probably, but not as great as you might expect mech decks to be on a map like Hell in a very small place. But you still get the 12 slots. You still get the versatility, right? I like to run like at least one card of Upvetted Alpini. While they lack at the tank rounds, of course, they're pretty good against infantry. 20 points, MG3, and 15 men, and light infantry, so very fast. Pretty neat. Lagunari, I'll admit, I haven't really given them a whole lot of try. They've never been particularly great. They're essentially Fanteria di Linea, but you pay 5 points for 5 additional HP. Yeah. Maybe if they had like the Blindecide, like the Maro, for the 15 or 14 AP, 500 meters launcher, 50% accuracy, they might be a better choice, but they just don't. So you want this, you want a cut of these bad boys, probably downweighted. You definitely want your Milan too. Want a Stinger. Then for your last slot, I think nowadays I'm thinking Guastatori might not be too bad. I think the M18 is kind of a trap, but the Guastatori for town fighting, probably a good deal, honestly. And in fact, they should get the 3 armor transport because they don't take an availability hit. Support tab, you don't get any of the MLRSs, but you do get the tube artillery. Or I would suggest you run the M110 if you're not sure, because it's probably easier and more consistent than an M107. I just think the M107 is a lot of fun, which is why I always run it. Automatic, of course, Hawk, because you don't get a Spada and Sedam. It's kind of the thing with nations, right? In certain aspects, they very often run the same things, especially if you have only one choice for certain types of units. 040 Mark III. I did run the Mark II, which was solid. You don't have to. And the M47 is like your closest thing you get for like a close range fire support, really. Browning in 3 HE, 8 RPM, 15 points, like I said, pretty solid. You don't get Komsubin, you don't get any Folgori outside of the Alpine 90. 2 cards of these might not be too bad for like weird, just for fighting infantry actually. Just solid for fighting. They have an MG3, they're shock. So that's neat. But you still get some pretty good recon options, and your vehicle type, you still get that Centauro. And don't forget, you get 2 XP here. Which doesn't matter as much for most units, but it's still very neat. You do not get a CBT. So that kind of sucks, but it's not as huge of a deal, because there's not much to support, because you're slow anyway. But it still would be nice to have, of course, to deny certain helo drops. And this deck also doesn't have great helo hunters, which is kind of so and so. Just for the sake of it, let's run the Ace 2 in here. And Ghibli's need to have Harrier, F104 GNC. I don't have the points. One of you has to go. Let's remove you. You can kind of do a wheeled opener with Bear Salieri, in Centauros and slash or your 60mm, you just don't have any anti-air support, right? So that's the important thing here. So yeah, this would be a mech deck, for example. Again, maybe the right choice is actually to just spam the 90s and ignore the other line infantry. I haven't tried it yet. And just eat the cost of them not being as efficient against infantry or meat shielding, but have the advantage of always having RPLs around. Maybe that's just the way to go, and I just didn't think of that yet, which is very possible. But yeah, this is just that. So for Thursday or whenever you're gonna get this DLC, if you get the DLC, and you're not sure how to build certain decks, just take a look at this. I'm not gonna tell you how to build the Marine or Airborne versions or support versions, because frankly there is so many units that at that point the deck kind of builds itself, because you just put in what you can. Yeah. When it comes to mixed decks, I think it is somewhat obvious what you want to bring, right? For example, your Fanteria di Linea 90, you probably want to put into your mech deck as well, especially it's just like the Alpine 90. You want to bring your Centauros in Mech and Moto. You want to bring the Rican Centauro in Moto. You might want to bring the Komsubi in Moto if you can fit them in, right? You maybe want to put the Paracata Tutisti 90 in Moto as well. Maybe to see them in Mech for like a cheap AA. Maybe you want to run this, but you're probably still gonna run the Gazelle Cannon. Air Tab. I don't think you really want. The Ghibli, by the way, basically a Cheetah D2. Although it has better timing on target, but the Cheetah has better missiles with 5 AG. So yeah, I think those are like, especially the Centauros, the Rican Vehicle Type 1, they're gonna be huge. Well, maybe you want to run these guys for mid shields. Who knows? But and Maro 90 for maybe for Marines, or base Maro for Marines. You already get the Remai Define for Marines, but you can now get base Maro, which are MG3 shock squads with an assault rifle and a blindicide actually. So they're basically the strongest variant of Modschützen Blue 4. I would still consider Modschützen better, for one, because the RPG-7 is like in my opinion, the best quote-unquote free anti-tank weapon in the game. Like the free in the sense that you don't have to pay premium for it, right? Because Apilas, you essentially in this case pay 10 points for example. The blindicide is quote-unquote free because 15 points is more or less the base for shock infantry. And the RPG-7 mice is the best, so I would probably in certain... Let me put it this way, I don't think the Maro 90 is just straight up better. They're better against killing infantry, yes, but they have worse anti-tank weapon, and they have a worse transport selection. Like, Mod should still get the BMP1s, which are great. BMP2s, which are also great, actually, now. Wink, wink. So, yeah, but still, now Blue for Marines gets this, and this is a very good card still. They get great 5-pointers as well, right? Don't forget that. This is still a very, very good card. I'm not saying this isn't a good card, by the way, with compared to the Modschützen sake. I think Modschützen are better. But this is still a very good card. Marines. Blue for Marines, which before that was already actually a pretty strong deck, is also now honestly quite up there. I think the only thing it's missing now really is just an ASF, because the Marine deck, the Marine planes this deck adds, the ADV is Marines, but it's a prototype, right? So it doesn't really add anything to the mixed deck. Like the Harrier, you still get, for example, the gray. The only thing really, like I said, Blue Marine Slacks is a proper ASF. You get a Tomcat, but it's just inconsistent. But I'm just rambling now, so hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you're excited for the DLC, and if you're not, I hope you're at least excited for the patch, because you should be. And I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye bye.